Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 7th Asia-Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. My name is Luisa, and I will be your technical facilitator today to ensure that you have a smooth experience with Zoom. You are at the session titled, Taking Climate Resilient Economic Development to Scale Through Technology and Practice. We will begin in just a moment here, but before we get started, we would like to let you know that this meeting is being recorded for documentation purposes. Furthermore, the chat box is also available in case you have any questions for the panel, or any perspectives you'd like to share, or if you'd like to reach me for technical assistance. For those of you just joining us, welcome. You are at the session titled Taking Climate Resilient Economic Development to Scale Through Technology and Practice. We are ready to get started. I will now pass the floor to Surichi Badwal, Senior Researcher, Earth Science and Climate Change Division, Terry. Surichi, the floor is yours.
Thank you for introducing me. A very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all participants who have joined us today in this extremely important session that focuses on taking climate resilient economic development to scale through technology and practice led by the ADB. Leveraging technology and practice is largely done through the use of appropriate policy and institutional structures that support its implementation on one hand, and includes a host of indigenous, traditional, and local practices being implemented by societies on the other. Besides relevant capacities, governance and research and development is also needed to support technology development and its deployment. So a host of areas that need to be addressed when we're talking about the use of technology and practice for building climate resilience. Resilience solutions are context specific and basically depend on the risks that are being discussed, the impacts being felt. They could be actually sectoral in nature, cross-sectoral, and of an interdisciplinary nature, felt on both biophysical systems and interconnected socioeconomic systems. A mix of interventions, both policies and practices and technologies, are needed to address the climate risks, with multiple actors playing different roles and responsibilities with regard to their implementation. The progress of the implementation is largely hinged around how effectively the various actors execute their roles and responsibilities in helping build climate resilience. This includes development, deployment of a range of technologies and practices that may assist in resilience building. There are many examples that exist and can be quoted that exemplify how technology and change in practices have assisted in building resilience across different sectors that impinge on the economy. This includes food systems, infrastructure, health, and water. However, these are implemented at very small scales, and there is need for upscaling and outscaling of these interventions for wider adoption to create larger impacts. The session with this objective, therefore, seeks to see how technology and practice can be used to scale adoption and create larger impacts. The focus would be on key guiding points, which relate to exploring the role of technology in big data and digital development, and practices in building economic resilience, targeting all levels, including the grassroots. For instance, the use of information communication technologies and sensor-based technologies in agriculture, fisheries, the use of modeling systems, remote sensing, and GIS in tourism, health sector, for instance, digital databases assisting in the monitoring and surveillance, as we saw being used in the case of the COVID in the year 2020, identifying barriers and bridges for implementing and scaling up of these technologies and practices, the hard and soft limits for implementation of technology and practices, for instance, the need for the right kind of incentives that would be required for scaling up these interventions, these initiatives, focusing on gender inclusivity in building resilience and contributing to adaptation, building capacities of women in core areas to ensure resilience building, given the fact that women are at the forefront of managing resources, food, water, health, scaling up of investments in nature-based solutions that promote economic development. There are examples across different parts of the world, including zero-till and IWMP, which is being propagated in some of the developing countries in the Asia-Pacific region. So given this introduction, we would like to cover many of these aspects and try to basically reach you with some of the examples in the work that is being done in different parts of the world. Get on to our keynote address. But before we move to the keynote address, we would seek information from you and have a poll question for the participants and request you to kindly fill in the details in the next few seconds, providing us with a background with regard to the organization you belong to. Could I please request for the poll? So we have the results with us, which basically indicates, we have presence from almost all organizations with many participants from representing international organizations, but a large chunk of people from the NGO sector and the academia as well. Thank you very much for helping us with this poll. And with this, I would basically move on to the keynote address. I would like to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Professor Ian Noble. Professor Noble is currently serving the Climate Change Institute in the capacity of an emeritus professor with the Australian National University. Professor Noble has a PhD in ecology. He has been acknowledged for his contribution in the IPCC's Nobel Peace Prize and has received an Australian Centenary Medal for his contributions to the field of ecology. He's also a fellow of the Australian Academy of Technology, Sciences and Engineering. In 2002, he had joined the World Bank with a challenge to incorporate both mitigation and adaptation in the bank's planning processes. He's continued to advise governments, financial institutions, development banks, and UN organizations, and the private sector on adapting to climate change concerns. He currently serves as a senior advisor to the Global Center on Adaptation. And with this, I would hand the session over to Dr. Noble.
Thank you, Suruchi. Just in case anyone's wondering, I do not have a presentation, so you're going to have to put up my background screen and my face. Good day to all of you, good whatever time of the day or evening or night it is at the moment. If we mention technology, we tend to think of smartphones, satellites, computer algorithms, and computer-controlled machines, what most of us call high-tech. It's basically handed down by technologists who are often trained elsewhere and supplied to market information, high-resolution mapping, and so on. But not all technology is high-tech. For example, there are ever-improving rules and guidance for rotational grazing or for cropping systems. People are always exploring old and new varieties of crop plants and establishing where they might fit in the cropping systems under a changing climate. These two are technologies, as is devising and often reviving better ways to work with nature. Now usually called nature-based solutions. But I want to gather these types of technology as not low tech, but local tech, because it's usually based on local knowledge and has been applied for generations. And I want to argue that technology makes its fullest contribution when it's integrated with local understandings of the skills that have been long contributed to our livelihoods. Now, if you want to see an example of this, I recommend that you read one of the many descriptions of the Netherlands NODWAD program, better known as Room for the Rivers. This program is very well known. It was to protect low-lying parts of the Netherlands from flooding from heavy winter river flows. That is, from inland flooding. It's not keeping the Netherlands safe from the seas. It's what to do with that water that flows into the Netherlands from the rest of Europe. Now, many assume that this program represents the application of high technology mapping, water flow modeling, and so on. And it does include this. This is very much the basis of much of that program. But in a recent review of the program, the author concludes the case of the NODWAD represents a paradigm shift in flood management that was developed, ironically, by reviving much older traditions. This included living on high land, diverting water into selected fields, calming rather than containing the flow of the rivers, the flooding rivers. High-tech aided and added to the detailed design, but the overall plan was largely a return to something that had been advised in the 16th century, and that is to treat the water not with force, but with sweetness. And that advice was still remembered by almost 500 years later by the landholders, the farmers there, who were actually stakeholders and that contributed to the design of the Room for the Rivers. So I argue that even in a wealthy nation, the technology ranges from high tech to the application, modification and reapplication of long learned understanding embedded in local practice, my local tech. Or put simply, technology without local practices is wasted, while local practice with technology is enhanced. Moving to another topic, how can we accelerate the scaling out process? I refer to the scaling out in contrast to the scaling up, in the sense that scaling out is seeing learning in one area applied in other areas. One of the greatest contributors of modern technology is that it can help both capture understanding and skills in one area, one location, and share it and modify them to improve livelihoods in another. That is, it can really be a valuable tool in adaptation at scale. But going to scale will also be helped by engaging two other groups of actors who are only partially engaged at the moment. The first one is the private sector. And here I include everyone from the emerging cash cropping farmer, very small scale private sector, through the small to medium enterprises, up to local companies and possibly sometimes even international companies. The private sector needs to protect both its supply and value chains. And we need that investment in those value chains where adapting to climate change is the economically logical thing to do. And that is almost all the time. The challenge is to move the private sector from treating climate change as a poorly understood threat, which is sometime off in the future, to it being instead another business risk that has to be managed along with many other types of risks that their enterprise faces, and sometimes can even be seen as an opportunity. So we need to mobilize that private sector funding. The other group, I hesitate to mention these, but I will. Too often we, that is researchers, NGOs and funders, feel that we've completed our task on demonstrating adaptation activities which have the potential to scale out. We need to be more proactive in taking that potential and learning how to scale it out effectively. This will depend on facilitating the sharing of local knowledge with neighbours, often through informal groups, women's groups, farmers associations, and so on. But this is also an opportunity for NGOs. And I think we need to see some NGOs specialising in focusing on the scaling out process, learning about scaling out per se. I know that there are some people listening here who are saying, but we're doing that. Well, great. I agree, there are people doing that. I know some are going to talk about that soon after me, but be more vocal. We need to scale you out to make sure that we have this skill there. And just to finish, one caution. We must also ask what the effect of any adaptive actions will be on the most vulnerable people, as the technologies for effective adaptation must not add to existing inequalities. Vulnerabilities arise not just from changing climate, but also from pre-existing inequalities, unbalanced power structure relations, and so on. As much as we can see the advantages of, for example, of smartphones in sharing information, doing the banking, etc., not every farmer has access to a smartphone or to a mobile plan which will bear the downloads. There is a dangerous feedback loop here, and it's clear that being left behind or left out increases vulnerability and exposure to climate shocks, which in turn lead to a downward spiral into greater poverty. So we need to remind ourselves again and again, leave nobody behind. So in summary, the challenge that I see is firstly to use high tech and local tech to enhance each other. The scaling out needs the engagement of the private sector and scaling out specialists. And finally, leave nobody behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Noble, for this excellent keynote address with many key takeaway points, basically highlighting the importance of local technology and practices in resilience building, and of course, the convergence that we need between the high tech and the low tech when we're talking about resilience building. With this, basically, we move on to the next part of the session. The next part of the session is divided into two parts, one with a focus on resilience practices for economic development, and the second with a focus on technology to build resilience and promote economic development. In the part on practices for climate resilient economic development, we have three presentations. To begin with, the first presentation is by Ms. Kirsten Mandala, who currently manages a portfolio of disaster risk reduction and climate change programming for Mercy Corps in Timor-Leste, building the resilience of vulnerable communities, the ecological hazards and the adverse impacts of climate change in both rural and urban settings. She has worked extensively in the Asia-Pacific region and in Africa. She's joined by her colleague, Ms. Sushila Pandit from Nepal, who is a development professional working in the domain of climate resilience, disaster management, and sustainable development for more than a decade now. They will be sharing the experiences of work on a multi-country project on managing risk through economic development in Nepal and Timor-Leste. I would like to hand over the floor now to the team from Mercy Corps.
Thank you so much, and I'm going to start sharing my screen, so apologies for the delay. My name is Kirsten Mandala, and as mentioned, I am the program manager for disaster risk reduction and climate change programming for Mercy Corps based in Timor-Leste, and I'm here today with my colleague Sushila Pandit, who's my counterpart program manager based in Nepal. Today, we're going to be talking about Mercy Corps' Managing Risk Through Economic Development program, funded by Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies, which is a program that works in Nepal and Timor-Leste in smallholder farming communities to increase the resilience of vulnerable households to the adverse impacts of climate change and natural disaster. In particular, I'm going to be talking today about how we embed economic resilience into our program approaches. The Managing Risk Through Economic Development program, or as we call it, the MRED program, works to address both rapid shocks and slow onset climate-induced stresses in both Nepal and Timor-Leste. For example, as you can see on the left, we are working in far western Nepal in floodplains. You can see a path of a river that has been mapped out year after year from 2013 to 2020. And as you can see, the path of the river is shifting, moving as much as a kilometer in the light blue line towards the community, which means that the community is not only facing annualized flood events, but is also seeing the gradual reduction of their arable farmland that is undermining their economic resilience. In the picture on the right, you'll see Timor-Leste, where we're working on similar, both rapid onset and slow onset shocks and stresses, including flood, landslides, windstorms, as well as drought and changing rainfall and climate patterns. Mercy Corps uses what we call a Nexus approach to address these problems, which integrates market systems development approaches along with community-based disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation approaches. And what we mean by this is that we're building off a foundation of traditional DRR and climate change programming activities by introducing what we call Nexus activities that focus on improving land management and crops that have dual benefits. And so these are crops that both benefit the community in terms of disaster risk mitigation and climate change adaptation, but also allow households to earn profit. And by focusing on crops and value chains that have robust market systems and strong private sector partners, Mercy Corps is able to use our market systems development approaches to ensure that there are market incentives pushing forward and scaling our program interventions. And so we see both community members and private sector partners investing due to incentives in scaling up some of these program interventions that have disaster risk mitigation as well as climate change adaptation outcomes. For example, we're working in 3 crops, sugarcane in Nepal, vanilla in Timor-Leste, and bamboo in both Nepal and Timor-Leste that have a variety of risk mitigation benefits. And so between these 3 crops, we're seeing improvements in river cutting, reductions in flooding and landslides, reductions in soil erosion, as well as some wind protection. All 3 of these crops were selected partly due to the strength of the private sector actors to allow for community members to be selling these crops at a profit, and for Mercy Corps to be investing in value chains that have the potential to scale, and for partners that have the potential to be investing in the scale up of program interventions. In terms of our implementation and scale, we're currently in phase 3 of our MRED program. In phase 2, we were able to reach over 220,000 individuals to increase their resilience towards the adverse impacts of climate change and disaster. And a lot of it has to do, in terms of our successes, with our Nexus approach and this focus on economic resilience. Our Nexus approach works because it's low cost and focused on sustainability. And we've been able to invest in our private sector partnerships and work to lobby local governments and see policy changes to allow for further investments to scale up our programs. We've had particular success with this in Nepal. And so by the end of MRED 2, for every single dollar invested by MRED in Nepal, an additional $4 were invested in disaster risk reduction and Nexus programming by government, community, and private sector partners. We have had some challenges in terms of this implementation. And as always, there's this challenge between depth versus scale. And because of this work across multiple systems and the need for really holistic resilience work that includes layered approaches with each household, we do see a tension in terms of being able to invest deeply and see the outcomes we want while simultaneously take this program to scale. We've been able to overcome this challenge in Nepal, largely due to these investments by other actors, but in Timor-Leste, we're still struggling with this due to weak markets and challenges related to governmental budgeting processes, where we really need to be seeing our investments in creating the enabling environments that will allow for this future scale. As noted in the keynote speech, we also have a particular emphasis on making sure we're not just reaching vulnerable communities, but reaching vulnerable households within those vulnerable communities. And so in both Nepal and Timor-Leste, we're paying particular attention to the participation and the outcomes related to coping capacities for vulnerable households and populations regarding women's participation and participation of vulnerable castes in Nepal in particular. We still see some barriers and challenges in terms of reaching those vulnerable populations, but have designed really robust measurement systems to be able to track them through this program and continue to increase our ability to reach the most vulnerable as we continue future phases. We're really short on time, and I want to make sure that we have time to hear from one of the community members who's participated in our program and her experience working with our Nexus programming and experience increasing economic resilience. And so I'm going to switch to a video that our Nepal field team has been able to share. But thank you so much, and we'll be available later for any questions.
नमस्कार मेरो नाम चाहिँ कलावती चौधरी यो विपद व्यवस्थापन समितिमा उपाध्यक्ष छु पहिला त यहाँ धेरै विपदै थियो सर भन्नुपर्दा यहाँ हामी बर्खा लागेको बेला हामी सुत्न पनि नपाउने कालो बाटो लागेपछि हामी कति बेला आउँछ र भाग्छ लाग्छ भन्ने जस्तै हाम्रो मनमा ढुकेको थियो पहिला हाम्रो त भन्दा 8-9 बिघा हो सर आजभोलि चाहिँ हामी पहिला त पारी यो नदी त उता जङ्गलतिर थियो तर आजभोलि चाहिँ यही गाउँमै नै पसिसकेको छ यस्तै छ 2-3 कट्ठा जति छ पहिला त हामी विश्वासै नगर्ने त्यहाँ त घाँस पनि उम्रिँदैन मरिहाल्छ कहाँ हुन्छ भनेर हामी आफ्नो जिद्दी गर्ने अनि सरहरूले धेरै विश्वास दिलाउनु भयो हामीलाई गरेर हेर्नु न पहिला किन यसरी भन्नुहुन्छ भनेर हामीलाई भन्नुभयो अनि हामी गऱ्यौँ अहिले त धेरै राम्रो लागेको छ सर हामीलाई किनभने पहिला त त्यतिले बगरमा छुट्याएको थियो आजभोलि चाहिँ हामी यसमा रकम फलाउन सक्छौँ भनेर हामीलाई विश्वास भइसकेको छ सर
Thank you, Ms. Mandala, for highlighting the use of a Nexus approach for promoting sustainable agricultural practices, besides addressing issues of market access and building resilience for economic development. Also, the differential capacities by gender that has been highlighted and the need for building capacities of women engaged in these practices is well taken. You have highlighted the fact of challenges that are there to scale these practices up, including the need for finance in some countries through your work that has been carried out in Timor-Leste. And also thank you for highlighting the fact that the program has been focusing on other elements as well, including building capacities of people, promoting cross-learning and documenting success stories through the video that we just saw. With that, we move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Mr. Sivakorn Udachao. Mr. Udachao is currently practicing farming and is a coffee producer in Thailand. A young entrepreneur, he founded Lazy Man Coffee in 2011. With this, I would basically hand over the floor to Mr. Udachao.
Sawadee krap. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sivakorn Udachao. I am Karen. So I was born in northern part of Thailand and live here many generations. So I would like to present on the traditional knowledge about the practicing on farming system. So we call in the local language hu in Karen. So if I could translate, it's maybe rotating. So what rotate energy, rotating food, rotating diversity, rotating nutrition and life. So this is the system. So I would like to say to call that ecological agriculture system, rotation farming. So you can see this photo. This is a harvesting season beside of the rotational farming. So you can see the forest and you can see the tree stump and also the diversity of the sesame, corn, tobacco, and also the rice grain. So when we planting and dropping the seeds, so we mix it together in the same time. And how can we prepare the land? So we use the very simple technique that we use knife cutting a tree and then we just burn it. So it's take normally for following season, we cut on February and then we dry it for 2 months, and then we burning on the middle of the April. So and then after the clean was clear, and so we make the small hole, we drop the seeds, and we mix the seed together, rice, vegetable, and also another variety, about 30 variety together. And you can see this is we can work it together, not so everyone can do work together. We sharing after finish this family, and then we change to other family to finish in like 1 month. And after that, the first of the rain come, we can see the germinate sprouting of the seed, like rice, corn, and we leave some tree stump that and support can be a support of the soybean family and other crop and food that we grow it together. And then the tree is not die, because when we cut in dry season, the tree is released, drain out of the water. So the tree is like standing. And then if we cut and then we burn it on in a very short time, like less than 1 hour. So when the rain comes, we can see a lot of the stump. When we cut one, is 3 will germinate, new one. And what about how many species and food that we can mix and grow together? So you can see the vegetable, fruit, crop that mostly for self-consumption, herb, and also you can see the flower that mix together, and all of the stump of the tree will not dry and dead. So it's all ready to sprout new germinate again. This is we call rotate. For example, we have 7 plot of farm. For the recent year, we use and we follow or leave it for six plot. Like if you have 7 plot, you use 1 in 6, 1 in 7, so that a new fallow is also provides another diversity. And for example, the plant, and also for the wild animal, for the animal that cattle, cow, and wild animal can come and enjoy together. Because of new leaf, new young leaf is good for the animal nutrition. And then we will come back again in year 7, like rotating. So as the academic result of the researcher said, every year of fallow, the farm can observe carbon from the air is about 1 ton. 1 ton. For example, observe 7 year is also can be a 7 ton. 7 ton, and then we cut it, dry it, burn. It's also released to the air 7 ton of the carbon. But 6 plot ready to observe 6, and then we call 0 waste of carbon. It's clean production technology, we can say, because 0 release and 0 observe. This is kind of a rotating observe. And you can see also the food security for the year 2 fallow. It's more than 16 variety of the food, crop, and animal. Following the level of the trees that grow is also the provide to the wild animal as well. And this is the example that it take about 1.5 years. So this recent year, we took the photo, and then it take about 1 year. It's recovered by the diversity and the plant, and after that, 1.5 years you can see, and 10 years return to the forest. This is we call rotating clean energy, the food security, diversity of the plant, and also the nutrition management, because we never use any kind of a fertilizer, chemical fertilizer, and herbicide. Thank you for providing my opportunity to me.
Thank you, Mr. Brichau, for sharing with us your experiences from the ground and the use of traditional knowledge and practices in improving agriculture and promoting climate resilience in crop growth and forests. You've highlighted the importance of rotational farming, mixed farming, and integrated farming practices, and the collective strength that basically helps in building sustainable agriculture and forest management. With this, we move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Ms. Charlotte Hicks. She's Senior Technical Officer at the UN Environment Program World Conservation Monitoring Center. She has basically helped in providing technical support and capacity building on biodiversity and climate change policy and actions, including REDD+ and ecosystem-based adaptation. Her current work includes developing tools to support more effective design and implementation of ecosystems-based adaptation. Her background is in international relations, political science, and Chinese studies. She has worked in non-government and government organizations in conservation, sustainable development, and policy in the Asia-Pacific region. So she has a rich experience from different work in different countries from the Asia-Pacific. And with this, I would basically request Ms. Charlotte Hicks to take on.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. It's great to be here today. What we'd like to do is to share some resources with you today that bring together two of the main themes of the APAN Forum, which is nature-based resilience and the theme of this session, economic resilience. In order to do this, my organization, so UNEP WCMC, as well as IUCN and Wetlands International, would like to share with you some interactive resources, as well as a video that we're going to watch later, looking at how nature-based solutions can support economic resilience. So I'm going to be putting these links into the chat. Okay, can everyone hear me? I seem to be having some computer problems here.
And we can hear you.
Okay. Okay, so as I was saying, we've put together some virtual interactive resources on nature-based solutions and economic resilience. Some of the speakers have also been talking about nature-based solutions, such as ecosystem protection, restoration, agrobiodiversity, and how they can support economic resilience as well. So I'm putting into the chat, first of all, a link to our virtual gallery, and this looks at how different ways that nature-based solutions can support economic resilience, including some case studies from Asia Pacific and beyond. Within that gallery, we also have an online survey where we are interested to learn more about how people see nature-based solutions, whether they're useful for economic resilience, and what barriers may be affecting their wider uptake and their scaling up. I'm going to put a link to the survey in the chat as well. And finally, we have a video for you. This is being shared by our colleagues at Wetlands International on building with nature in Indonesia. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, our Wetlands International Indonesia colleagues couldn't join with us today. So just to give you a quick overview on their behalf, this video is going to look at 5 years of building with nature in Indonesia. This was an initiative that aimed to restore mangrove forests in order to halt coastal erosion and protect coastal infrastructure, whilst also improving economic resilience at the local scale. I won't go into all the details here, but just to highlight some of the results, as well as having environmental benefits, of course, and social benefits. In terms of economic resilience, this work has tripled incomes for farmers through the introduction of mangrove aquaculture and optimizing productivity. It's also seen the recovery of coastal fisheries in areas with restored mangroves. And in addition, it's resulted in increased allocation from government budgets to the area through things like village development plans and improved regulations. So that's it for me. I'm just going to give you that brief overview. We're going to go straight to the video now, Building with Nature in Indonesia. I hope you enjoy it. And please, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or get in touch afterwards. Thank you.
Orang tua kami telah mengingatkan bahwa kami harus melindungi hutan mangrove dan tidak menebanginya untuk dijadikan tambak. Sekarang dengan hilangnya sebagian besar mangrove, laut telah menyapu tanggul-tanggul tambak kami hingga masuk ke daratan sekitar 1 mil. Dan desa telah kehilangan 25 baris tambaknya.
In the Demak district of North Java, Indonesia, the coastline is severely eroding as a result of sediment disturbance. Mangroves that protected the shore and held the sediment have been cut down and replaced by aquaculture ponds. To make matters worse, the land is sinking due to groundwater extraction by cities and industry. This combination of factors has left the coastline and communities exposed to the daily tides, as well as extreme weather events that are occurring more frequently due to climate change. In efforts to quell the tide, concrete sea walls were placed, but these collapsed in the soft mud and blocked the sediment transport inland. Efforts to plant mangroves also failed because the water had become too deep. A new approach was needed to restore coastal safety and revitalize the local economy. A consortium of local communities, scientists, engineers, NGOs, and the government was brought together, led by Wetlands International, EcoShape, and the Indonesian government. Together, they designed an integrated solution to restore the mighty mangrove belt that once protected the land. To enhance coastal safety, permeable structures were constructed by contractors and villagers in the most severely eroding areas to trap sediment and create the right conditions for mangrove recovery. Today, communities own, monitor, and maintain the structures. In other places along the coast, unproductive aquaculture ponds were converted back into mangrove forests. In addition, local farmers received training in sustainable aquaculture practices, which boosted productivity and tripled their income. These economic benefits enabled farmers to give up part of their aquaculture ponds to make space for mangroves.
Sebelumnya kami sebelum mengikuti SL, saya menggunakan bahan-bahan kimia. Tapi hasilnya di situ kurang memuaskan karena sering terjadi yaitu kematian udang. Adanya SL di sini saya rubah sistemnya yaitu memakai yang ramah lingkungan yaitu komposisasi atau penggunaan mol. Sekarang saya mulai yaitu berbagi ilmu, berbagi pengalaman saya dan berbagi keberhasilan saya kepada kelompok-kelompok di pinggiran pantai seluruh Kabupaten Demak. Saya tunjukkan pada teman-teman, ayo bangkit, ayo jangan malas, buktinya ada.
In 5 years, this project has grown into a landscape-scale initiative along 20 kilometers of eroding coastline in central Java. The use of permeable structures to bring back mangroves has been replicated by the Indonesian government in 13 districts. Sadly, the coastal restoration efforts in Demak are severely challenged by the sinking of the land, caused by unsustainable pumping of groundwater by cities and industries nearby. Young recovering mangroves are being washed away and ponds suffer from flooding. To facilitate a solution to this land subsidence, the project partners initiated water dialogues at national and provincial level and worked with communities to help them express their needs.
Ini adalah rumah kami. Insya Allah kami berencana tetap tinggal di sini. Saya berharap proyek ini dapat menyelamatkan dan mengembalikan hutan mangrove kami. Saya merasakan ada harapan baru.
What we have been pioneering in Indonesia can be replicated elsewhere. There is no standard blueprint, and upscaling has to recognize that. Building with nature is going to be the answer to coastal protection in many places.
Solutions like this that engineer with nature can help protect not only coastlines, but also rivers, cities, and beaches. We are sharing our knowledge, training the engineers of the future, and removing policy barriers for building with nature instead of fighting against it. Join us in upscaling this approach in Indonesia, Asia, and beyond.
Thank you, Charlotte, for highlighting the role of nature-based solutions in supporting economic resilience and presenting with us, the different case studies through the video. Also, basically highlighting how these solutions are very important when we're basically talking about building economic resilience. With that, we open the floor for question and answers. You could type your questions in the chat box, or please feel free to speak up. Please do highlight the speaker to which you're targeting the question. There are also questions invited for the keynote speaker, so please feel free to interact with the team out here. So can we have some questions, and could we see if we have a raise of hands? Okay, since we have not received any questions for this session, we move on to the next round of discussion and open a poll question again for you to fill up. Can we please have the poll question up? We would like to request you to fill up the second poll of the session. You would be able to choose only one option, and maybe whatever option is your first choice is something that you could basically select. So thank you for your inputs. What we basically find from the audience is that to be able to promote innovative adaptation practices at scale, what is the most important factor is to look at innovative partnerships between different actors, the government, private sector, and civil society organizations. And the second option is basically to do with the right kind of evidence that needs to be created and research, to generate these ideas and interventions that basically can be considered for deployment. Thank you very much for your inputs. I would like to thank all speakers of the previous session for the excellent presentations and contributions to the discussion. We will now basically move on to the next part of the discussion, which is going to focus on technology for climate resilient economic development. The discussion is likely to surround on the role that technology plays in assisting in building resilience and scaling up, the role of different stakeholders, and we did see in the call also the role of government, non-government organizations, private sector in promoting this, processes for engaging, developing, and deploying these technologies, and what kind of collaborative models, networks may help scale some of these initiatives that we're talking about. With that, we basically move on to the session, and our first speaker is Dr. Joost Beckers from Vandesat, a remote sensing company that uses technology for the benefit of resource management. Dr. Beckers specializes in hydrology, flood modeling, and climate risk assessment. He has a background in physics and has 20 years of experience in water-related research and consultancy. He has worked for some time with Delta RES in the Netherlands, the United States, and many other countries. Thank you, Dr. Beckers, for being with us today. And I would request you to please, start sharing your ideas and thoughts on how technology can be considered and looked into for promoting economic development.
Thank you, Suruchi. Let me share my screen. Hope this works. Could you confirm that you're seeing a slide?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. So thanks, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about remote sensing and application to strengthening resilience of the agriculture sector. My name is Joost Beckers. I work for a remote sensing company in the Netherlands called Vandesat. But I have a background in water management, as Suruchi mentioned. A few years ago, I got excited about remote sensing and satellite data, mainly because of this picture. Now, the size of the satellites in this picture is exaggerated, but the number is not. At this very moment, there are about 3,000 active satellites circling the planet. And not all of them are Earth observation, but 1,000, so about 1/3 of them are Earth observation satellites. So imagine the vast amount of data that is coming from these 1,000 cameras pointing at the Earth all the time and taking pictures all the time. It is a great challenge to make use of these data. And in this presentation, I will try to give you an example of applying these data. And the example is to drought insurance, that is to strengthen resilience of agriculture. But before I do that, let me just explain to you that the first important step that we need to take is to process this data, because the raw images that come from these satellites are frankly speaking, quite useless. Imagine a very noisy black and white picture. And you need to take a few steps to convert this to useful information. And that is what remote sensing companies like myself or like Vandesat do. What we do is we combine images from different satellites and light at different wavelengths. We combine them with ground data like land use or soil composition. And we apply models and laws of physics that translate the radiation received by the satellite to physical properties on the ground. And then you get products like soil moisture, temperature, or biomass, and things that you can relate to on the ground. And these products these are the useful products from remote sensing that offer all kinds of opportunities for monitoring and interesting applications. And for drought insurance, in the example I will give you, we will use the soil moisture. So, but let's talk about drought for a minute. Last year, it was estimated that there were 20 billion US dollars losses in agriculture, mainly because of drought globally, but only 2 billion, so 10% was insured. And the main reason for this is that arranging drought insurance at the farmer level is quite complicated. Whenever there's a drought, the farmer needs to make a claim and the insurer needs to agree on the loss. And the damage assessment process is quite costly and time consuming. Now, index insurance that offers a solution. In this type of insurance, the payout is triggered by some quantity that can be measured objectively. So there's much less discussion about the validity of the claim. And there's no need for a claim form or a lengthy damage assessment. And the satellite soil moisture is a perfect candidate for this objective quantity. The insurer and the farmer receive information about soil moisture and they agree on a payout if a threshold is crossed. And of course, and even you can automatically distribute payouts. There's an example in Africa that a farmer gets a payout on his phone without even issuing or submitting a claim form. So it's very automatic. But of course, you need to tailor this insurance product to the local farming practice and to the local crop. For a specific farmer that needs insurance, you need to determine what crop he is growing and what is the growing season and when does the crop needs water. And then you monitor the soil moisture in his area of interest during the growing season. And you compare the observed soil moisture to what is normal in this time of the year. And then if the deviation from normal conditions or the anomaly exceeds a certain threshold, then a payout is made. So you can set this threshold based on historical data in the same season. And the farmer and insurance company can agree to these thresholds and the amount of payout beforehand. So here you see a comparison of the drought. In this case, is a drought in Eastern Europe, in part of Bulgaria, and the drought in 2020 was much bigger than the anomaly was much bigger than in the years before. And if the insurer and the farmer agreed to a threshold, then in this case, a payout is made. Now, this type of insurance is being applied more and more worldwide, and my company has been supporting these schemes in some 15 countries already, together with our insurance partners, including countries like Kenya and Kazakhstan, and we are keen to support similar constructs in Asia. And some lessons that we have learned from experience over the past years are firstly that the satellite data are very reliable and very suitable for this index insurance, but we need to provide very easy access to this data to all the stakeholders so that at all times they can view the current status or the data of the current status of their fields. And secondly, we learned that we carefully need to tailor the insurance products to the local needs. This involves setting a threshold for payout, but also the amount of payout and the period that is covered. So this is the exact definition of what we call a drought and what we call a severe drought. And this is something that farmers and insurance companies, together with remote sensing specialists, need to work out together. And finally, to support this tailoring of the insurance product, it is important that all the stakeholders thoroughly understand the product and the satellite data. And this often requires some capacity building in the form of training or workshops. And this will ensure that there is no difference in knowledge level between the insurer and insured. And then they can agree on an insurance contract. So I will stop here. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Beckers, for highlighting the role of data, reliable data with easy access and its use, and the use of tools and techniques and technology for building resilience in taking climate resilient economic development to scale, and highlighting the various ways in which the information can be used, including for financial planning, for planning and crop growth. Also, what you highlighted is how we can tailor high-tech information for the users. In this context, you were explaining the role of the farming communities and information that can be provided to the farming communities using some of these technologies, and thereby in turn build resilience. Also, something that I take back, it's just not about providing the technology to the people, but also the need for building capacities so that people are on a level footing in terms of use of that particular technology. So thank you very much for highlighting those points. With that, we basically move on to our next presentation. Our next presenter is Ms. Caroline Yu. She is a climate risk management specialist with Regional Integrated Multi-Hazard Early Warning Systems for Africa and Asia, RIMES. She is also the project director for RIMES, component of the World Bank Climate Adaptation and Resilience Initiative for South Asia, which is basically a regional project that aims to contribute to an enabling environment for climate resilient policies and investments in select sectors and countries in South Asia. She has more than 10 years of experience of work in the weather and climate field, and she has been contributing to work, both working with climate information providers and the users of it across various sectors. She's basically worked, with many stakeholders, including national entities on, contributing to work on disasters, agriculture and disaster management, and also with the local communities. Her area of interest is basically to see how ICTs can be put into application and used as a technology to help users at the other end. With that, I hand over the floor to Ms. Caroline Yu.
Thank you very much, Suruchi. Let me just share my screen very quickly. Okay, so good afternoon again, and good morning to everyone based in the West. This afternoon, I'll be sharing RIME's experience in Myanmar, particularly on decision support systems and agrometeorological forecasting for farmers. And I'll just start the presentation by highlighting certain elements of, this is not working. Okay, so let me just start my presentation by highlighting two main issues with climate data or weather data from the end user's perspective. Generally, it has to do with accessibility as well as reliability. So basically, end users pretty much oftentimes don't have any idea where to get the data or where to find the data or how to use it, and perhaps how or what are its limitations also. And so RIME's work has oftentimes focused in terms of working with national hydromet services in our member countries and collaborating states. And this has very much focused on looking at ways to ensure that weather and climate data is more understandable. And then we work also with sectoral agencies like Department of Agriculture, Department of Disaster Management, and other sectoral agencies, as well as end users, to ensure that the data or the information is translated in a way that's more useful for them and according to their needs and requirements. And the last one also is we provide guidance as well as platforms so that these end users can actually access. They will understand where to get the information that they need. They will also be able to understand how to make use of the data, including its limitations. So for the last few years since RIME's inception, we have been developing a number of platforms. So we call this databases or data platforms. And in some cases, we were able to develop decision support systems. So we have a number of decision support systems for different sectors like disaster management, agriculture, health, and then we have also for transport sector this time. But I'll focus my discussion on the DSS for agriculture. Okay. Sorry. So the DSS for agriculture is called Sesame. You might be very familiar with the word sesame as a crop, and very interesting because the history of sesame was actually based on our first work in Myanmar, particularly in the dry zone, where sesame crop was widely planted. And that is why we call this tool as Sesame. So the main components of Sesame actually are only two. One component is comprised of all the weather and climate data. So forecast like daily forecast, 3-day forecast, 10-day forecast, as well as monthly and seasonal forecast is available there. Also climate information for particular townships or regions in Myanmar. And then on the other side of the component, there are crop-related information. So major crops, for example, in the dry zone where the tool was piloted, were integrated into the system and into the database. So this information would include information like data like crop calendars, crop growth stages, as well as requirements in terms of rainfall, temperature, humidity, soil moisture, and all other weather parameters that could be integrated. So we introduced this tool along with comprehensive capacity building for farm schools. So earlier, there was mention of coastal field schools. In our case, we also have farm field schools where we ask farmers, for example, currently what their extent of use of weather or climate information is, what is their understanding of seasonal forecast, how they're currently using it in planning and decision making, and whether they would be interested in getting information from Hydromet services or through the Sesame app, which we provide to them. And so I'll just show you very quickly what the Sesame app looks like. This is the visualization of a map of Myanmar indicating the millimeter of rainfall for specific townships. And then this is the forecast for 10 days divided into pentads, pentad 1 and pentad 2, and the different parameters that are there. So this is rainfall, maximum minimum temperature, humidity, and potential evapotranspiration. And this section actually talks about advisory. In the last 2 to 3 years, we've actually improved and enhanced the advisory section with more crop-specific advisories. So for example, for drought-resilient crops, we might have different advisories compared to flood-resilient crops. Or for sesame, we might have a different advisory from green gram or other crops. So that's how we have sort of enhanced the system over time. I'll just show you also how we do the capacity building for farmers. So we do the user needs assessments, the farmer needs assessments, so that we can customize the training material and the information that we would provide to them. And then we develop or customize the curriculum. We test it through a training of trainers. And then finally, those trainers will then train progressive farmers or farmer leaders who have mobile phones, because I understand Ian mentioned earlier that most farmers, especially in rural areas, do not have access to mobile data or let alone have mobile phones. So we made sure that there are progressive farmer leaders who have access to these technologies and can download or can view our mobile app. And so farmers at the end of the training would have some understanding on the different options, the different decisions that they have on their hand whenever different weather parameters are available. So if they receive a forecast, in this example, for instance, they receive a forecast of heavy rainfall in the next 5 days, they're saying that, okay, they can postpone their fertilization schedule for their plant. So there's different advisories and different actions based on the forecast that they receive from the app. And I'll just mention two relevant outcomes of this program or project that we have in Myanmar, particularly in the dry zone. So in 2017, this Sesame actually started in 2015, and we did the comprehensive training. And then in 2017, we sort of realized that there has been good progress and good outcomes out of this program. For example, in the central dry zone, during the cyclone Marutha in April 2017, DOA officials and extension workers actually informed the farmers that there's going to be a cyclone coming. So their advice was to harvest their crops early. And then another advice was they could prepare already farm inputs for early planting. And so it was interesting because those farmers who heeded the advisory were able to save their harvested crops from being damaged from the cyclone. And also they were able to plant early a 3-month variety of sesame. So they reported actually that this was a first good harvest for them in the last 7 years. In the same way in Moniwa Township, when the district officer of DOA received forecast for rainfall, she proceeded to provide advisory to farmers to skip the irrigation. And then she also asked farmers to prepare drainage or leakage canals. And this very simple advisory resulted in savings for farmers who follow the advice. So not only savings, they were able to preserve their crops, and for some, they were able to even increase production. So these are just very, very small examples of how we can increase the resilience of farmers and also microeconomy. So I'll end the discussion, the presentation here, and look forward to questions and discussions with the rest of the participants. Thank you again, and good afternoon.
Thank you, Ms. Yu, for the excellent presentation, for highlighting the role of technology related to seasonal forecasting for decision-making purposes, the importance of working with stakeholders to use the technology to the needs of the stakeholders, besides the use of simple tools that provide access to the information for effective on-ground responses. So, basically talked about how technology should be custom tailored to the needs of the people, and also parallelly building capacities of people at the other end to be able to use those technologies. So we are talking about not only availability of the technology, but also making sure that the technology is accessible to people and using simple tools for that purpose. Thank you very much. With that, we move on to the next presentation by Dr. Bijan Khazai, who is a co-founder and CEO of Hotel Resilient. He has a degree in earthquake engineering from University of California, Berkeley. He joined the faculty at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology in Germany, leading the group on vulnerability and risk, and was thereafter appointed the vice chair. He's also served as a senior research fellow of the Willis Research Network in London and as principal investigator of the Global Earthquake Modeling and Integrated Risk Modeling platform. He's also led many international consulting and research projects on disaster risk management on behalf of the World Bank, UN organizations, worked with several NGOs and governments. In 2016, Dr. Khazai led an international consortium of universities and private sector partners to develop standards for multi-hazard disaster risk management for hotels and resorts under the Global Initiative on Disaster Risk Management, leading to the founding of the Hotel Resilient in 2020, which is quite interesting because it was a COVID year for most of us, a scientific benchmarking and hotel advisory company based in Germany. Over to you, Dr. Khazai.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be with you here today. And I'll segue us from farming and agriculture into tourism and hotels. And I'll talk to you a little bit about Hotel Resilient. So, resilience is really a boundary term, known as a boundary term. It has different meanings used in different ranges of fields. It can be stable within a given field, but it tends to be very loosely defined across fields. And if you look at what does disaster and climate resilience mean in tourism, and particularly in terms of functional operational processes of hotels, to define a framework and indeed standards, there is the engineering science of it to look at sort of the resistance to these disruptive forces. And you're looking at the reduction of consequences or losses to hotels, or how quickly a hotel can come back into an operational status, in fact, to its initial state. But maybe in some cases, the initial state isn't the desirable state to come back to, as COVID has showed us, or we're talking about climate change. There is an opportunity to bounce forward. And there's another form of thought, the adaptability thinking in terms of the capacity of hotels to innovate, adapt, and overcome disruptions, or the critical role a hotel plays in its community in terms of providing livelihoods, protecting natural resources, and contributing to the resilience of the community. You think about hotels as a space for shelter and evacuation. So indeed, that was the basis of the Hotel Resilient Initiative back in 2015 to really define what is a resilience framework when we focus down at the systems level of hotels, which has buildings and internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. And there had been no consistent practices. In fact, 60% of hotels don't have crisis management plans to date. So there was a collaborative effort between academia, industry, and government to develop these standards, a global standard on climate change and multi-hazard disaster risk reduction for hotels. They have to be risk-based. So for that, you need a software. And to get people to understand it, training around it. So PATA, United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Office, and the German Development Cooperation came together and created this initiative called the Hotel Resilient Initiative, which has since been founded into an organization as a scientific benchmarking organization and a certification body. So what's behind the system? There is a standard, of course. These are 250 elements. They go at the building level, anything from what happens at the site where the hotel is situated, the foundation of the building, to the roof connections. A rapid vulnerability screening of the hotel is carried out. And then we look at what are the systems within a hotel to contribute to resilience, infrastructure systems, evacuation systems, warning systems. And finally, there's a roof to all of this that houses it, the management side. What are the roles and responsibilities? How do we communicate in a crisis with all the different stakeholders? What is business continuity? So we've defined standards that are also based on risk. So they're not generic standards. And to illustrate that, here's analytics that we offer hotels. Usually insurance companies have access to this. Your average hotelier would not. It's a 10-kilometer grid of multiple hazards. So you have the hazard, you interact that with the vulnerability of your building, for which you have the characteristics, and then you can come up with a risk footprint of your hotel for each different hazard. And based on that information, you can take action to improve your resilience and in fact, get a resilience score in terms of improving your systems and your management capacities. And you see here, we have also climate change as a key component. We've aggregated it into here as one climate change risk score, but indeed, this breaks down into multiple climate risk metrics. So we're looking at the variability of different types of hazard through climate change models that are globally available models that have to be locally appropriate. There's a lot of stuff on this, but again, it's not accessible in the hands of hoteliers. So we've tried to break this down, make it accessible. We use different projections of these climate models, and we use a climate resilience framework that brings understanding of your climate risk and into what you can do in terms of climate action to mitigate and adapt. And here's an example of what some of this data looks behind. So here's a riverine flood current 2020 baseline versus what it could be in 24. So 2020, we have the indices that look at very low to high. And for 2040, we use a worst case, business as usual. So if we didn't do anything, what could happen? And we're looking at multipliers where the red can be as much as twice the initial risk. That's for floods. And here's another one for coastal flooding. That was river flood. This is coastal flood. You go through the same scenario. You can do this for multiple periods, for different projections. And you put this into the system. So the first thing that a hotel would have available to them once they sign on to the platform is they can see the analytics. They select whatever hazard. I'm just showing the climate related ones, but of course there's the geophysical ones as well. And then you can look at the hazard at your site and zoom into your property level. Then you go through the audit and you provide these 250 elements, again, from the foundation, the site characteristics. So what is the soil type you're situated on? And there's engineering calculations behind it that provide you with a risk score. Then we provide resources. We call these audit resources. So once you conduct your audit, you have all these resources to learn what actions you can take And to provide a lot more context around that, there's also an interactive e-learning portal that you can obtain, and hotel staff can go and learn a lot more about this stuff in an interactive way. So I'll close with that. And there is a website where you can also access the online platform for free. Anyone can register on that and get access. And we've made available for now we're also implementing COVID standards. And that's all available, the audit, the e-learning, all those resources to any hotel that wants to use it, all available for free. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kasai, for this very interesting presentation and introducing us to the global standards that have been developed for hotels and resorts now. It's a very interesting area of work, and I can see that also basically highlighting the various ways in which tools and technologies are being applied for that purpose. And with that, basically, I would move on to the question and answer round. There are some questions in the chat box, I believe. And I just want to check one of the questions. I think the chat box is basically marked to Mr. Just. And I just would basically request Mr. Beckers to take a look at the question and see if he would like to respond to it. I think what is being said in the question is that India has a robust agricultural insurance program under implementation. However, claims are decided on the basis of village-wise randomized measurements, which is a massive exercise in itself. Apart from cost savings, how granular is data obtained from satellites for effectively setting claims?
Yes, thanks for the question. Yes, well, like local measurements, this is also something that is done often. I know examples also in Africa where you can use weather stations, for example, as a trigger for insurance and insurance payout. There is always a small downside or criticism by some people that local stations can fail, and what to do in a situation where you obviously see that there is a drought, but the weather station provides no data. And the good thing about satellite data is that it's very, very reliable, and it could also be used as a backup for local stations in a sense. So there are ways to implement an insurance product using either local stations or satellite data, or a combination of the two. Does that answer your question?
I would request the person who's posted the question to just unmute and respond. Okay, so we're not hearing from the participant. Patrick Jasper, I hope your question has been answered. I just, so maybe a question from my side, and I was just wondering, are these data sets quite expensive, and how cost effective are they in terms of, accessing them?
Yeah, well, good question. Well, you do need, I'm a bit biased here, but I would say I would advise to use a remote sensing specialist as an intermediate to provide the data. Some data are freely available, but in an insurance product, you depend so heavily on this data that I would recommend to have a service level agreement with a company that you are always sure that you have the data in time and that it's of sufficient quality. Yeah. But then the cost, if you compare it to the total, the other cost of the insurance product is relatively low. You can think of a few percent. So it's really marginal compared to other costs of insurance.
Yeah. Interestingly, there was a report that came out last year by CDP in India, which basically approached different private sector entities to understand the risk to them because of climate. And the financial institutions, the banks basically had huge numbers, and they basically declared that they were more at risk because of the losses that are likely to be incurred. And a large part of their products are linked to insurance and agri-credit. So, so yes, very interesting to know that. And of course, I would assume that such kind of examples would be available for other countries as well. So with that, we move on to our next round of poll. Can we have the poll up, please? Questions related to basically identifying the key barriers, the most important barrier that you think comes to your mind in terms of preventing successful uptake of adaptation technology. Can we have the results up? Most of us have basically voted for limited financing that is willing to take the risk. And closely to follow up with it is the need for institutions and regulation that may help support uptake of the technology. Thank you. And I think I'm surprised to see that the private sector engagement has received a comparatively lower vote. With that, basically, we come to the close of the session. But before we basically close, let us round up the discussions by requesting each of our speakers and panelists who've been with us to summarize a key recommendation in 20 seconds. May I request and follow the same order that we had in terms of the presentations, Dr. Ian Noble?
Thank you. Look, thank you for those presentations. They show really excellent progress is going on. But I would still ask that some organizations really focus on the process of scaling out, as I've been calling it, because I think we have a lot of learning there that can be shared and carried through. This is not just going to the nearest villages, but to other regions in nearby countries and so on. I'll leave it at that.
We move on to Ms. Kirsten Mandala.
Thanks so much. I think what we've heard today is that a lot of this work requires deep contextual understanding in terms of the actors and also incentives for engagement. And I think it's really critical before we get to that scaling phase to have the ability to pilot interventions and ensure that they're working in the context that we're talking about, especially in terms of engaging the most vulnerable groups. Thank you.
Thank you. We move on to our next speaker, Mr. Sivakan Udachao. Mr. Sivakan.
Thank you. Today, a lot of information I got to learn, and so I will take time to learn about that more. Thank you for giving me my opportunity today.
Thank you. A pleasure. Ms. Charlotte Hicks. Ms. Charlotte Hicks.
Charlotte actually had to leave early.
Okay. Okay. So then we move on to our next speaker is Dr. Houston Beckers.
Hi. Yeah, well, I have no further comments, but I think it was a very interesting collection of presentations. And
Any message that you would like people to take away with them?
Yeah, well, regarding my presentation, I think that I explained about the technology, but well, I don't want to offend my colleagues, but I would say that is the easy part. The difficult part is, I think, connecting to local communities and convincing them about this technology, that it can help them to enhance resilience.
Ms. Carolyn, you?
Thanks, Ruchi. I think I just highlight the response that I made to one of the questions earlier. In our implementation of our programs, we've learned that technology, when we introduce technology, it should be based on the needs as well as requirements of the users. And it should also be introduced or turned over to the users in a way that it's combined or integrated in a comprehensive capacity building program, so that at the end of so that the end user, the sectoral agency, or even the ultimate end user would be able to utilize the system, the platform, in its full use, and hopefully integrate this in their planning and decision making to improve or to enhance their resilience. Thanks.
Dr. Kazani?
Sure. Yeah. For my part, I think we saw today that there's just a wealth of information out there, and the science around climate change is complex. So I agree with you. The technology might be the easy part, but good technology is hard. And that's really translating all that science into actionable metrics, useful information, and making it relatable to business processes in the sense of, what does it matter to their bottom line, cost savings, cost avoidance, revenue growth. And I think that is tricky to do and not that easy, but I think that's an important piece of the equation that we have to get right. Thank you.
Thank you very much for highlighting that. And with that, we've exceeded our time. I would just put some key points that have been discussed by the panel just in a few seconds. I think some of the good points that came across was basically looking at the integration of both high-tech and local technologies for enhancing each other in terms of implementation. The point of processes that are being used for sharing of technologies and practices, so that these technologies and practices can reach every possible corner to help build resilience and promote economic development. The need for engagement of different actors, including the private sector, looking at the potential of scaling out through co-learning and sharing experiences, and of course the inclusivity context, where we need to basically take into account all sections of the society, the vulnerable populations, and gender balance in terms of considering the spread of these technologies and practices. So with that, basically, I would close the session, and I would like to thank all the panelists and the speakers for giving such excellent presentations and sharing their views and their work with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for attending today's session as part of the 7th Asia Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. Please join us for the key messages of the day, and then immediately after, we will be having a special event titled Filling the Adaptation Gap. You can find the link to join these sessions by returning to the Sessions tab on the APAN Forum Conference community on Hubelo. Within the community, you can explore the exhibitions as well as chat or set up meetings with other conference attendees. Join the conversation on social media using the hashtag APAN2020. Thank you once again for your participation, and see you in the next sessions.